conference entitled Diversity, Coexistence, Policymaking, organized by CESPIC. The Center for Peace Science, Integration and Cooperation, which has been operating for 2 years within the university, and which is committed to the development and spread of peace science in this, in line with the mission of the Catholic University. Now, I stop here. I give the floor to our rector, Professor Bruno Giardino.
Thank you, Raul. And well, just a few words to start. And first of all, of course, I wish to thank very much Professor Raul Caruso for the beautiful work done in organizing this meeting and for really for the stimulating title given to this conference. It goes directly to the heart of the problems we are more and more confronted to. A special thank is also due to all the speakers who will give us a new window, I think, on the crisis, the global crisis we are confronted to. It is really a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with friends, colleagues, at the opening of this workshop on diversity, coexistence, and policy making. The title per se tells us, we hope, that a new era is coming. It outlines the importance of the mission of the university for peace and development in this time of crisis in the global international society. We still have, and we shall have forever, under our eyes, the violence of the terroristic attacks and wars which are spread all over Europe and the world. On our side, what can we do? There is one thing that we can realize almost immediately. We must invest much more resources and time in the young generations to promote, to enhance a new culture of solidarity, a new culture of political approach, trying to solve this dramatic crisis, which is not only economic. In fact, the crisis is essentially that of the human being values, which should be at the basis of a new development. We, as university, have a fundamental social and political role. Our main goal is to improve all over the world the quality of life, outlining that this can be reached only if we are able to promote a true dialogue, a true respect for cultural diversity. In other words, a true respect of human values. All these issues will be treated by all the speakers who will open, I'm sure, a great window on the future of what we hope and we believe is a new era of international cooperation, solidarity, and coexistence. I believe that this morning, due to the scientific value of our guests, of our speakers, will be a great scientific and a human experience. Thank you again, and good work. Thanks.
Thanks, Professor Giardino, for this introductory words. Just 1 minute to explain, especially at the benefit for the students, the rationale of this meeting. And as we have said, even in the previous event organized by CESPIC, peace is something concrete. Peace is something which is going to be produced by means of actual policies. This is exactly the rationale of this meeting. In the sense that we are not going to speak about peace only as a commitment of our souls. That's a prerequisite, okay? But actually, we need policies. We need proper and accurate observation of reality, and eventually proper design of actual policies. So this meeting is intended to proceed on this path. It's why on the panel, the speakers are professors who are expert on this. I would give you just a brief introduction to everybody. From your left, Professor Mansour Morshid from the Coventry University and Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, who is an economist, a top expert among economists of roots and causes of conflict and economic policies related to remove these roots. Then there is Professor Esteban Clor from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, is the top expert among economists, among Israeli economists and among the many economists in the world on the terrorism and the impact on terrorism on individuals' behavior. Professor Kaplan from University of Oxford is a professor of international relations, is a political scientist, and is an expert on peacekeeping and especially on Balkans. He works extensively on Kosovo, so he knows the Balkan situation very good. So, their expertise, and Andy Bala, which is close to me, is from the Albanian Institute of International Study, which is a very important, I would say, think tank here in Albania. And I'm happy I'm happy he could come, because in this way we also start cooperation with local organization here. And of course, in this issue, they work extensively on foreign affairs of Albania, and in particular also within the Balkan scenario, including also the Kosovo, including the Kosovo. So I think that we have the best panel ever, in the sense that we can bet that the discussion will be extremely interesting and fruitful. So what we do is that they are going to speak each 20 minutes, more or less. I have to say that unfortunately, for some institutional commitments, Ambassador Cutillo, Italian ambassador, couldn't come. He apologized for that, and it's a pity, but there will be other occasion to meet him. So what we are going to do is exactly this. Each is going to speak 20 minutes, more or less, and eventually we would like that to have a Q&A, questions and answers round, especially if these questions come from students. From faculties are well accepted too, but if students participate into it, would be hipper, okay? So I would start. The first speaker is Professor Kaplan from Oxford, as I told you before, and the title of his talk is Protection of Minorities in Post-Conflict Scenarios, the Case of Balkans.
Yes. Thank you. I want to say first, it's a great pleasure to be here. First time I'm here at the Catholic University. I want to thank Professor Caruso and CESPIC and the university for inviting me to take part in this discussion today. I'm going to be talking about protection of minorities in conflict and post-conflict situations, so a little bit broader perhaps than my title suggests. And when I refer to the Balkans, I have largely the former Yugoslavia in mind, where I have greater knowledge of the experiences there. And let me just start by saying why, well, first of all, minorities. What do we mean by minorities? Here too, I have in mind national minorities, primarily. There are other minorities, sexual minorities as well, but I'm going to be talking about the ethnic national communities and minority protection of those communities in particular. And why minorities, as we're talking about peace, conflict prevention, conflict mitigation, conflict resolution? Because minorities in this region, in this period, and not only incidentally in this region, but across Europe, have thought to be at the center of many conflicts, especially because of anxieties, insecurities that minorities have felt and experienced in this period, especially of transition since the end of the Cold War. So a lot of work has been done to protect and promote minority rights in this region and elsewhere, especially in post-Cold War Europe, with an eye, again, as I said, to preventing conflict, reducing conflict, or even resolving conflict. And a few years ago, I wrote an article in which I described Yugoslavia as a laboratory for minority rights protection, for initiatives in this area of minority rights, because there is arguably no other region on the continent that has produced, that has generated as many initiatives in the area of minority rights protection as the former Yugoslavia. And I want to talk about those in my presentation. But before I do that, I want to broaden the context a little bit and look at this against the backdrop of other developments that were happening in post-conflict, post-Cold War Europe. In other words, what I want to suggest is that while it is true that more effort, more initiatives were taking place in this region of the former Yugoslavia, this was part of a much larger set of initiatives in Europe after the Cold War that were concerned with the protection of minority rights. So we saw, for instance, the establishment of new instruments and new institutions, such as the OSCE's High Commissioner on National Minorities, the EU Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe, the Council of Europe's Framework Convention for National Minorities. These and many other instruments and institutions were all concerned with the protection and promotion of minority rights more than anywhere else in the world at this time. And as I said, especially in the former Yugoslavia. But let me just, if I may, read to you from a report that the Parliamentary Defence Committee, the UK House of Commons, the Defence Committee of the UK House of Commons in July 1990, so this is just a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 7 months in fact, they warned in July 1990 that as the threat on the Central Front, East Central Europe, as the threat on the Central Front recedes, the possibility of regional or national conflicts upsetting European stability comes into sharper focus. Now, we take that for granted now. We look back, we know. We've lived through the wars of former Yugoslavia. We have lived through the wars, some of them ongoing in the Caucasus, and other tensions across Europe. But this was a novel concern in the early post-Cold War period. The threat, the Soviet threat, which became the Russian threat, was still dominant. Nuclear weapons proliferation, an ongoing concern, was still a greater concern, I would say, than ethno-nationalist conflict. There were still sectarian conflicts in my own country, in the United Kingdom, of course. We had a very significant conflict with in Northern Ireland. So it wasn't as if there was no conflict on the conflict, but this was very low, if you will, on the list of security concerns. And then we have the eruption, especially of conflict in the former Yugoslavia, and a recognition that, as I said, anxieties on the part of national minorities was a key driving force behind violent conflict. And that's why a lot of the initiatives that I'm referring to were directed towards national minorities. So let me now come to the former Yugoslavia, and I want to focus on 3 areas, not all of them, as I said, post-conflict. Indeed, but they were all undertaken after violent conflict began in 1991, starting with Slovenia. But there were 3 things that I want to look at. One was the recognition of new states on the part of the European community, as it was then. The second is a number of measures that were taken in association with the promotion of democracy, democratization. And the third were the accession criteria for accession to the European Union. And all of them had conflict-relevant provisions that dealt with minorities in each of those. And the first of them, as I said, was the recognition of new states emerging from the former Yugoslavia. What the European community, as it was then, decided, and this was very novel, this was very unusual, it was going to attach conditions to recognition of new states emerging from the former Yugoslavia. So it recognized that the breakup of Yugoslavia was inevitable, although there was a lot of debate among member states of the European community about that. But once it agreed that it was inevitable, and nothing could be done, as they say, to put the genie back in the bottle, the decision was taken to try to manage this process as peacefully as possible. And one approach that was undertaken, as I said, was to attach conditions to the new states emerging from the former Yugoslavia to satisfy requirements for the protection of minorities on their own territories. And the idea was that these protections would reassure minorities that they would be safe and secure within the new states, and therefore they would be less inclined to take up arms to support violent struggle against the new state authorities. That was the logic, right? And you may remember, you may know, there was a lot of controversy here with Germany recognizing Croatia and Slovenia, and a lot of division among the European community. But they did all accept this policy. And some of the provisions of this policy were very far-reaching. The boldest of them concerned minority communities who were, in their own areas, a majority. So I have in mind, in particular, the Serb communities of Croatia, the Albanian communities in what was then Serbia, in Kosovo, and there were other communities, Croat communities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serb communities in in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there were minorities who across this region in their own geographic area were majority communities. And the European community required of the new state authorities that they accept to establish special status, especially for these minorities, these communities. And it consisted of a number of things, including the right of minorities to have and display national emblems, to have a second nationality alongside the nationality of the Republic, an educational system that respected the values and needs of their group, and most important, and this was probably the most far-reaching, a legislative body, an administrative structure, and that would include a regional police force, and a judiciary responsible for matters concerning the area. So this was almost a state within a state, and that was the worry that a lot of these new states emerging from the former Yugoslavia had, that this would lead to the further breakup of also these new states, these republics. But the thinking was that unless you provide these very far-reaching guarantees to national minorities, they will not feel at home in their new states. Now, we can talk about whether the logic was sound. We can talk about how well these new state authorities implemented these provisions. And we can talk about the consequences that they had. But that was the thinking. That was the thinking. And as I said, it was very novel because until this time, states, when they were recognized by other states, were normally recognized unconditionally. Meaning there was a practice a long time ago of attaching conditions, but the trend had been to move away from conditionality because that was introducing politics to international law, international diplomacy. So the idea was to take conditions out of recognition, but this was in a way going back to a past practice. Okay, so that was one area. The other area, and this was really post-conflict, this was after many of these conflicts in Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, again, not just now the European Union, but also the international community more broadly, they put pressure on these new state authorities to incorporate a wide range of minority rights protections. Took various forms. Incorporation of international and regional minority rights conventions into their own constitutions. So for instance, the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina has a very long list of conventions that are about respect for minority rights that are an integral part of now their basic law. So incorporation of rights into their constitutions, the articulation of additional minority rights, guaranteed representation of minorities in elected and appointed offices, guaranteed. So there were seats that were set aside, there were offices that were set aside for minorities who had guaranteed representation in these political bodies. And finally, also support for political party development of national minorities. And these were really an extraordinary effort, very far-reaching, to ensure the protection of national minority rights and interests. But there were also concerns about going too far in this direction. So, just to give you again an example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was support for the formation of new political parties, but there was a recognition that some parties, if they were developed on the basis of radical platforms, would be threatening to the stability. So the international community, in particular the Office of the High Representative, made judgments about which parties were acceptable and which were not. And that raises questions about even how democratic international governance of these territories was, because they were choosing to eliminate parties. So, for instance, there was a party that formed in Bosnia-Herzegovina, a Bosnian Serb party, which was fined $50,000 for simply emphasizing the provisions of the peace agreement, the Dayton Accord, that gave autonomy to Republika Srpska, right? They were not advocating for anything more. They were simply putting emphasis on to the exclusion of the other parts of the peace agreement. And the Office of the High Representative found that this was unbalanced. It was communicating the wrong idea about the nature of the new Bosnian state after the war. And so they fined them for adopting what they considered to be a radical and threatening position. So, throughout the region, as I said, and to this day, there are provisions in the constitutions for, again, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the representation of the three constituent peoples, Croats, Bosniaks, Muslims, and Serbs, so that they will never feel that they are without any representation. Even if an election were held, I'm sure that the Croat representation would be lower, for instance, but they still have a higher representation to reassure them, right? Now, there are other minorities, other national minorities. There are Jews, there are Roma. In Kosovo, there are Egyptian, Ashkali. And these minorities are actually not represented. They are not offered the same level of protection. They are smaller in number. But this creates a problem. For instance, it is constitutionally impossible for a president of Bosnia-Herzegovina to be Jewish or to be Roma, because the Constitution allows only for a presidency of three constituent peoples. So, because of that, the European Court of Human Rights found that these provisions, and these are international provisions, these provisions were unconstitutional. Well, unconstitutional, that they were in violation of other provisions of the Bosnian Constitution, and that they also contradicted European rights and laws. So in June 2014, they required Bosnia-Herzegovina to revise the Constitution to eliminate those provisions that were discriminatory against other minorities. To this day, the Bosnians have not done that. Right? So they have not been compliant with this provision, with this ruling of the European Court of Human Rights. So there are problems. There are problems, arguably, when you protect some minorities, you disadvantage others in some cases. And the last area I want to mention, so I've talked about recognition for the establishment of new states. I've talked about democratization, governance arrangements in the new states. And I'll mention briefly, lastly, is accession to the European Union, of which we've now had two former Yugoslav states, Slovenia and Croatia. But the European Union has required, not just for the former Yugoslavia, but for all states acceding to the European Union, that they demonstrate respect for minority rights, and this means satisfying conditions that were adopted, what are called the Copenhagen criteria, in June 1993, conditions for respect of minority rights. And this, again, the former republics of the Yugoslavia have had to demonstrate that they have done to the satisfaction of the EU. Now, if you look at human rights reports, for instance, Human Rights Watch, you'll find that all of these states, to one degree or another, are considered to fall short of international, regional and international standards of respect, protection of minorities. But in defense of the European Union, many would say that they have come farther than they would have if they had not been under any pressure at all. I'm in your hands. Ignore. Okay. Okay, shall I continue? I'll just have one last thing to say, actually. Can you hear me? It's very distracting. Let's wait one moment and see if maybe, you think, or no? Will this go on for a long? I continue. Better? Okay, I just feel I'm competing. Okay, last thing I'll say. Can you hear me? You can, okay. Okay, last thing I'll say. John Stuart Mill, philosopher, maybe well known to many of you, liberal political philosopher. In 1861, he wrote in an essay called Representative Government. He was very pessimistic about the capacity of pluralistic societies, multi-ethnic societies, very pessimistic about their capacity for democratic governance. And this is what he wrote. Free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities. Among a people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages, the united public opinion, which is necessary to the working of representative government, cannot exist. Okay? A very, very pessimistic view of the prospect for peace within a country made up of different nationalities, of different communities. And the European Union, in response to the breakup of the end of the Cold War, the collapse of communist Europe, obviously took a very different view. They argued that not only is it possible for free institutions to function in pluralistic societies, but it is an absolute requirement, right? So that was and remains the view of the European Union, because you have to ask yourself, what would be the alternative, as it is in many other parts of the world, and as it has even been in the post-Cold War period in parts of Europe? It would be the elimination, the separation of, or the elimination of minority communities. And as we've seen, that has been absolutely catastrophic when it has taken place. So I'll leave you with that. Just as I said, an overview of the European approach in particular to the management of ethno-national diversity in relation to conflict on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaplan. I think that after his speech, we all understand why he has consulted the United Nations, has led the Institute on War and Peace, and edited a specialized journal. In particular, I would like to highlight this. Among commitments of CESPIC, there is also the commitment to build up a library on peace, on social sciences and peace. And so we have bought some books of Professor Kaplan. So if you want to depend his work on this, now you find his book in the library. Okay. The next. Just to another reminder, we are on live. We are live in streaming on as we have done in the past. Thank you. So the next one is Professor Esteban Clor. As I told you before, he comes from Jerusalem, from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In particular, is serving as director of the Department of Economics, and is an expert of economics on terrorism and counterterrorism. In particular, of course, the reason to invite him is a double genus phase. On the one hand, he's a top scholar. On the other hand, he is a scholar who works in a territory, in a state, which is, by definition, which is unfortunately characterized by violence and behavior of people, individuals, and organizations are affected by the political violence. So he has he got us a PowerPoint presentation. Then we thank, because we have a student that is volunteering in supporting our professor with the slides. So to you.
It's okay. We can leave it like that. And thank you very much, Professor Caruso. Thank you very much, Professor Giardina, and all the authorities of the university for inviting me to this panel and for your hospitality. It is also my first time in Albania, and I am very pleasantly surprised about the country, about the university, about the people, really, truly having a really good time, and I hope to come back soon. So I'm an economist, so I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to try to use a PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to be talking today about the political violence and, unfortunately, the lack of coexistence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as a quantitative social scientist, not only I will try to show you some of the insights of my research, but I also would like to show you some of the data behind those insights and how we reach those insights. Okay, so it is in addition to other forms of violence and counterterrorism. So I will look at also the effect of house demolitions or closures or curfews, etc. And I will look at the main question is, does violence affect the political views of the citizens, and in which direction? So a priori, one might think that violence leads to more radicalization because I've been attacked by the other side and I don't like that. So that's one possible reaction. But the other reaction will be, it could lead potentially to the opposite reaction. So I can become more moderate. Like I could reach the conclusion that there is no point to all this violence, that continuing the conflict is very costly for me. And so I can become more moderate and more willing to grant territorial concessions. So before we started analyzing this data, we didn't know what the data was going to tell us. Okay, so just to give you a little view of the data, the type of surveys that we have for the Israeli population ask these particular questions before every national election. So the questions that are being asked from the Israeli population is, do you agree or disagree to territorial concessions to Palestinians? Do you agree to the establishment of a Palestinian state? And do you find yourself as a right-wing or a left-wing individual? And who would you vote for in the upcoming elections? These surveys are conducted within 2 weeks of every elections. We see that the Israeli population is fairly evenly divided. This is around 50% of individuals agree to territorial concessions to the Palestinians. Also in the last years, around 50% of the individuals agree to the establishment of a Palestinian state. But the main question remains, how does violence affect these attitudes? Okay, so I can show you here a little graph. So what we have here is, at the district level, the change in the number of terror fatalities, Israeli fatalities that died in terror attacks at the district level. So an increase from left to right means that there were more Israeli fatalities. And what we have in the y-axis is the change in the views regarding more concessions. So an increase here could be interpreted as an increase in moderation. Okay? So what we do is that, except for Jerusalem here, which is an outlier, for every other district in Israel, the more fatalities there are, the more willingness to grant concessions, territorial concessions, okay? And the same case we have here for support for a Palestinian state. So here we have here change in terror fatalities at the sub-district level, and we have here the change in support for the creation of a Palestinian state. The more fatalities there are, there is an increase in support for a Palestinian state. So again, we could think that the Israeli population becomes more moderate as we observe more attacks. However, when we look at the voting intent of the Israeli population, we obtain a little bit of a puzzling picture, because on the one hand, more terror attacks lead to an increase in the agreement to grant territorial concessions and the creation of a Palestinian state. However, they also increase the support for the right-wing bloc of Paris, which is the bloc of Paris that is taking a harder position vis-a-vis Palestinian violence. So on the one hand, the Israeli population is willing to grant concessions and to create a Palestinian state. On the other hand, what they want is harder measures to stop Palestinian violence, in the sense that they want more roadblocks, more curfews, and more military operations against Palestinians. So when we look at the entire picture, it's not that the Israeli population becomes more moderate as a consequence of terror attacks, but they want more and more to separate themselves from the Palestinian population. So the creation of a Palestinian state and granting territorial concessions is not because I am more moderate and I understand the grievances of the Palestinian population, but it's because the occupation becomes very costly for me. So it is costly for me in terms of the level of violence to occupy those territories, and as a consequence of that, I want to separate myself from the other ethnic group, and I want to stop the level of violence in a very aggressive way. If we see one of the leaders of the Palestinian movement at the time in 2002, they understood this reaction very well, and they explicitly stated that the goal of terror attacks was to increase losses in Israel to a point at which the Israeli public would demand a withdrawal from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Again, would demand this not because they understand Palestinian grievances, but now they understand the cost of occupation. Okay, so this is the reaction of Israelis. However, Israelis understand the cost of occupation, but they also want to retaliate. Okay, so what we see during the second Palestinian uprising is that there is a heavy cost to Palestinian population from Israeli retaliation. There's an increase in settlements, increase of curfews, military operations, house demolitions. The Palestinian economy was completely destroyed during 2000 and 2006. So the cost was not only for the Israeli public, but it also affected the Palestinian population. So that's from the Israeli, this is what we obtain our results regarding the Israeli population. We have a very, very similar analysis using the attitudes of the Palestinian population. For this case, we use surveys conducted by a Palestinian think tank at the Birzeit University in the West Bank. And again, what they have is surveys of a representative sample of the Palestinian population between 2000 and 2007. We have, again, a very large number of Palestinian answers to this question, 32,000 observations. And the main two questions that they ask that we follow is, which faction do you support, and whether or not you support negotiations with Israel. The Palestinian factions are very indicative of your political stance. If you support Fatah, then you're more moderate than if you support Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Okay, so it's very clear that support for Fatah expresses a more moderate position vis-a-vis support for any of the other groups. Again, we see that the Palestinian society is fairly divided between the two positions. We have that 30% of the individuals in this time period between 2000 and 2007 support Fatah, which is the more moderate option. 22% of the population support Hamas, and we see a lot of disengagement. Almost 30% of the population, of the Palestinian population, does not support any of the political groups and chooses the group according to the different circumstances. We have that 60% of the population supports, on average, continuation of negotiations with Israelis, and 37% supports the stopping the negotiations with Israelis. Supporting the negotiation doesn't exclusively represent a moderate position, because a lot of people support the continuation of negotiations together with violence against the Israeli population or Israeli occupation. Okay, what we see here, we have a number of fatalities. 1 week, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks, number of fatalities, Palestinian fatalities at the hands of Israel. And what we have in the y-axis is change in the support for negotiations. Okay, so what we see is that how Palestinian fatalities affect the support for negotiations over time. Okay, what we see is that there is a short-term radicalization of the Palestinian population. So Palestinian fatalities cause a decrease in the support for negotiations with Israel, meaning that the Palestinian population becomes more radical, but it's not long-standing, this effect. It vanishes within 10 weeks. So an increase in Palestinian population causes the Palestinian population to become more radical, but within 10 weeks, they return to the actual levels. I didn't say this, but the Israeli effect is more long-standing. And we see a similar effect in terms of the support for Fatah. So Palestinian populations cause a decrease in support for Fatah, so an increase in the support for Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which are more radical movements. So there is a decrease. It's not that pronounced. Again, it's a small decrease, and then we come back to the steady state. So this is not a long-lasting result or effect of fatalities. The other thing that we tested, and I didn't bring the graph here, but it was important to see, was the effect of other counterterrorism policies on the attitudes of the Palestinian population. So we looked also, for example, at house demolitions. There is this policy in Israel where every individual that is suspected of being associated with terrorism, the Israeli military may decide to go and demolish his or her house, and it's been widely used. Over 6,000 houses were demolished in the last 15 years. And we observed that, for example, the house demolitions of Palestinian militants has a radicalization effect that is more long-standing. Okay, so for example, what we see is that Palestinian public opinion becomes more radical when Palestinian fatalities increase or when other counterterrorism measures are used, and the effect tends to vanish rather quickly, and fatalities seem to drive Palestinians to support away from Fatah and toward more disaffection from political factions. Now, when we look at house demolitions, what we see is that go back. One more. Thank you. What we see when we look at house demolitions is that house demolitions lead to the radicalization of the Palestinian population, and what we have here is the number of Israeli fatalities as a function of radicalization. So if I look at the survey, I see the Palestinian population becomes more radical. Does that translate into more attacks against Israel? Okay, and the answer is yes. So it takes 120 days to prepare and to plan an attack, but when political attitudes matter, in the sense that political attitudes may also lead to an increase in the level of violence. So this is a very grim picture in the sense that Palestinian violence leads Israelis to support more counterterrorism measures, like, for example, house demolition. So Palestinian violence leads to more house demolitions. House demolitions lead to the radicalization of the Palestinian population, and the radicalization of the Palestinian population leads to more attacks against Israel, which leads to more house demolition. So what we have here is a very grim cycle of violence, that violence is feeding itself, okay? Israeli violence leads to radicalization of the Palestinians and to Palestinian violence, which leads to the radicalization in a way of Israelis and to more Israeli violence. So in this sense, when I'm talking about the lack of coexistence, I'm talking about a cycle of violence that is feeding itself. So how can we break this cycle of violence and increase trust and coexistence between Palestinians and Israelis? That's a very difficult answer. That's a very difficult question. It's very difficult to find an answer. Leaders of Israel and Palestinian and the US and Europe are trying to find an answer to this question in the last 50 years. And what we did, when we look at a more longer time analysis, we do find evidence suggesting that major political events have had a longer term impact on political preferences. So what we have here is, the year of birth of Palestinian individuals. So again, we're looking at the Palestinian surveys, and we have the year of birth of the Palestinian individuals. And what we have here is a measure of radicalization. So it is a well-known fact in political science that older individuals are more moderate and younger individuals tend to be more radical. However, what we're trying to see is what's the effect of major processes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the political views of individuals at the formation stage. So individuals tend to form their political views when they're teenagers, between the ages of 15 and 20. So we look at the individuals that were 15 and 20. What happened during what happened at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict during those 5-year windows, and what are their views today? Okay, so what we see here, we have these blue dots. All these blue dots are individuals that were between the ages of 15 and 20 during the Oslo peace process. Okay, so these individuals formed their political views when, on a very positive time, where there was hope for the creation of a Palestinian state and for peace. And what we see is that these individuals, all these blue individuals, are more moderate than I would expect, which is given by this yellow line. So when you form your political views during hopeful times, you tend to be more hopeful and more moderate than expected. On the contrary, we have here these red dots. These red dots are individuals that were between the ages of 15 and 20 during the first Palestinian uprising, during the first Intifada. It was a very grim time, a very violent time. We see that consistently these individuals tend to be more radical than expected. So if we want to have some hope for the future, I guess that this is a hopeful picture showing that if we get to stop violence and we get to restore peace negotiations, future generations are going to be more willing to coexist than otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Clore. Now we have to switch the laptop for the other presentation, I think. Just a few words about Professor Clore's presentation. One is, please give me 12 seconds to be a professor. I think that's from the presentation is clear how we can really use data to understand political and economic processes. I mean, the study of political attitudes is not, it's not novelty, but it's not so old. Only in the latest 10, 15 years, we have been looking more in depth in how people shape their beliefs about their political views. And I think that from the presentation of Professor Clore, the remarkable point is to remember that the lack of coexistence is influenced basically by the cycle of violence which has been lasting for years, and basically this cycle of violence affects people's attitudes with regard to the conflict. So that means that what I'm saying is basically that things are not static in reality. Even if in handbooks in the university we try to study everything in a static way, but reality is dynamic. And the presentation by Professor Colley explained this, how dynamics do affect our individual beliefs. Okay, so next we can shift to the next presentations by Professor Mansour Murshid. As I told you, is one of the top economists in the world who studies conflict, has been studying conflict for 30 years now. He comes from the Coventry Institute of Social Studies, and the topic is horizontal inequality and internal conflict.
Oh, thank you very much, Raul, and thank you very much, Rector, for taking such good care of us and inviting us here to this very extremely interesting venue. I'd just like to start by saying that, Raul, you know, peace is not natural. War is. War is the natural state of man, not of humanity, but of mankind. So, what do I want to say? So we move down a slide, please. What I'm interested in and what I worked on, and the reason I became interested in conflict, not in peace, is that I am an economist who was working on, you know, the growth problems of countries which are not growing fast. They're not doing well. Their economy is stagnating. Poor countries in Africa, but also elsewhere. And so you find that a lot of them had internal conflict, particularly civil war, especially low-intensity civil war, sometimes high-intensity civil war. So then the penny drops slowly, but in the last 20 years, the penny dropped. And it's like this, you know, poverty is related to conflict in a circular way, in the sense that conflict creates poverty, and poverty makes the risk of internal conflict high. Okay? Also, there's an interest in the since the end of the Cold War, in the by the strategic studies academic community in failed states, complex humanitarian crises, and so on. Okay, so the development people and the strategic studies people. So the development people are composed of academics. They're composed of UN agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, you know, churches, missionaries, you know, that kind of groups, as well as, you know, people who wear uniforms, military uniforms. They can come together in considering the issue of conflict. Okay? So that's a kind of a starting point. So where do we go from there? Okay, what do we aim to achieve? Okay, so state building, poverty alleviation. These are the sort of mantras. These are the kind of things which are said all over the place. Okay, and is this happening automatically, or are you clicking? You're doing very good. You're doing very well. So I don't need to prompt you. Thank you. Yeah, go to the next slide. Here I have a little bit of a characterization of the what the academic literature regards as the causes of conflict. And there are three broad things we can say. Okay? So all you have to do is watch a mafia movie or a Blood Diamonds movie, or even look at the towers in Bologna, and you understand the greed explanation. Okay, the greed explanation is essentially competition amongst warlords for the control of resource rents. Okay? Then there is another explanation which says that the state is weak. Okay? And then you have the traditional explanation which is based upon, people are unhappy. There's a grievance. Okay? And all of these have been there in sort of the, the work of Aristotle in his Politics. I mean, you can find comparisons there. Next slide, please. Okay. The history is the following. As far as I've been working on this, I first started off working on this when the greed explanation was dominant. It was dominant through the work of someone called Paul Collier and his associates. And around 2000, about the turn of the millennium, this was the dominantly accepted explanation. So if you went to a minister for development cooperation, usually her speechwriter wrote the speech based upon the work of Professor Paul Collier and the greed explanation. And I emphasize the word her because around 15 years ago, the major ministers of development cooperation in Northern Europe were all women. And what did it say? As I said, all you have to look at is in the towers in Bologna or, watch The Godfather and you understand what it's all about. Okay, it's a turf war. So, then because we are academics and we were skeptical or maybe even envious of Professor Paul Collier's oxygen of publicity and everyone taking him seriously, presidents putting out red carpets, I once traveled on a plane with him to Uganda, and I was out of the airport in 10 seconds because the president had sent someone to receive him in a manner which was like a head of the state. Okay? So, what we do is we trash his findings, right? We find, and we've succeeded, and I won't go into the details because all you have to do is essentially change the data points so it's not robust. The results are not econometrically robust. It may be better at predicting how long a civil war will last, because if you have diamonds and things like that, don't show me that please, Raul, okay? If you want to annoy me, just show me, don't show me that, yeah. And the other thing is that it may be more related to oil, gas, and alluvial diamonds. Okay? Right, next slide, please. So, what Collier does is he nuances it. Is to say, okay, this is only going to work in very, very poor countries, okay, which have, essentially where poverty is endemic and so on, right? So he nuances it. Okay, next slide. Then we have this parallel group which talks about weak state capacity. There's a professor called James Fearon who promoted it, Fearon and Leighton, who say that, basically because it's the inability of the state to coerce and provide public goods. In other words, the state cannot police its population, nor can it provide security and a few essential public goods to the population, and therefore everything becomes privatized. Security becomes privatized, everything becomes privatized. And I've done some work on how civil war affects the capacity of the state, particularly its ability to gather resources. And it seems that it does have a very, very negative effect on resource mobilization by the state. Okay, next slide, please. So, then we go back to the grievance argument. The thing is that now the grievance argument is dominant, okay? The greed argument, the weak state capacity argument of 15 years ago, of 2000, is being replaced by geeks and other professors, as well as people who write, op-eds in newspapers with the grievance argument. Now, grievance is, it's very good to be in a Catholic institution about grievance because it's like, it's like poverty, it's like deprivation. It's always with us. It will be with us from the beginning of time to the end of time. So, the problem with the grievance argument is that both on the, shall we say, the right and the left, there is this statement that grievances are just, ubiquitous. They're just there all over the place. It is only some grievances which will come to the fore, which will come to the front, which will translate into a mass mobilization. So, therefore, grievances only matter if you can mobilize resources to turn that grievance into a violent struggle. Okay? So, we have this mobilization theory business as well. So, you've got to have other ingredients there. Grievances are never enough. Okay, next slide, please. So, one grievance which I think is important to talk about today is essentially inequality. See, Raul wants me to talk about horizontal inequality when horizontal inequality is obsolete and he doesn't know that. He will find out slowly. It will take him a glacially slow process of working that out. But essentially what is important nowadays is just inequality. And inequality is something which is very, very high and getting higher, particularly in the English-speaking developed world as well as the developing world. So, it's like cholesterol, right? So there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. So some degree of inequality is necessary to incentivize us as well as reward those who are hardworking. But what's bad cholesterol is inequality of opportunity and particularly discrimination. That's where the minorities aspect comes into fore. Okay? Next slide. So, bad inequality, particularly discrimination based upon, gender, caste, religion, color, and so on, is very, very difficult to shift. You can do something about other forms of inequality which are which are more transient, but those, so, we refer to these as both as inequalities of opportunity as well as categorical inequalities. So, when Raul and I next see each other in a place called Antwerp, there'll be sort of geeky people who'll talk about what's in the next slide. Come on. Thank you. The parallel to this is certain developments in our discipline. And the two sort of major developments in our discipline of economics in the last 20 years, in my humble opinion, are essentially the growth of something called behavioral economics, as well as a sub-branch of that called the economics of identity. I put that first in the slide because economics of identity is more salient to conflict, more connected to conflict. Okay? So next slide. So essentially, the economics of identity says that, individuals are not individuals. Individuals define themselves as members of a group, and there are certain group-based norms of action. So, and essentially, groups can also make these group norms self-enforcing. You don't need you don't need huge structures of incentive, other structures of incentives to be introduced. They are self-enforcing. Next slide. So it means that from the point of view of conflict, it is possible for people to take the group's deprivation into account, even if they're individually in themselves not deprived. So I could be quite an educated person, not a poor person, quite an affluent person, but I identify with the disadvantage of my group and then take maybe violent action. Okay? Then behavioral economics says our preferences are endogenous. What does that translate into ordinary language? Normally in economics, we take individual preferences, you know, what we want to eat, what we want to do, how we want to act, blah, 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 as given. Now, the new development in economics says, no. Okay, let's study the processes in which preferences are formed. And they're formed through, you know, the interaction of people with other people in society, but also history. Okay? So these are the two sort of quite important developments in our field. Okay? So going back to what Raul wanted me to talk about the dying concept of horizontal inequality. Horizontal inequality, I've given so many talks about it that I'm so fed up with it, but essentially what it means is inequality between groups, not inequality in a society which is otherwise, you know, homogeneous. Okay? A colleague of mine from Oslo will describe it slightly incorrectly as horizontal inequality is group inequality and vertical inequality is individual inequality, okay? Which means absolutely nothing to me. So horizontal inequality is best understood in terms of examples, okay? So, you know, in Albania it would be the inequality between Christians and Muslims, okay? In Northern Ireland it would be between Catholics and Protestants. In the Palestinian-Israeli context, obviously, between Jews and Arabs or something like that, okay? So it has an economic dimension, a political dimension, and the reason it wasn't looked at very deeply in the past was there's no data, and there still isn't much data, and there certainly isn't time series data. We have some snapshots, we have some photographs, we have some still photographs, but we don't have the dynamics. Except that that's been redressed by, you know, some colleagues to a certain extent, but they focus more on political horizontal inequality, you know, the access to power and the access to the political process, and they find that very important in explaining conflict. Economic horizontal inequality is very, very hard to establish because there is very little data, except in some countries, like Indonesia. All right, skip this one. Yeah, go to the next one. I think I'll skip this one as well. I just want to go back to the issue of inequality, because I definitely think that this group inequality business is becoming a little bit less relevant in explaining conflict and in explaining the lack of peace, if you want to achieve peace. We just have to look at inequality once again in its traditional way. Why is that? The reason horizontal inequality became important in conflict studies or in peace studies was that people felt that, you know, in an unequal society, which was homogeneous, there would be no conflict. Unless the inequality was between groups, because groups can take collective action. They can organize themselves into sort of warring factions against each other. So you can go to a society where there are rich people and poor people, but the poor people cannot revolt unless, you know, they have a label which says, describes them, you know, as belonging to a particular ethnicity or language group or religion. Okay? So they cannot organize it. That was the argument. No? Okay? Now we have to think of inequality in general, just rich and poor people. The reason is inequality is rising at an alarming rate. You know, while sipping very good quality grappa, Raul last night was talking about, you know, the best investment to make, and he tells his students that, is in real estate. So what we observe is, you know, wealth rises faster than income. So in other words, wealth is increasing faster than national income in most countries, particularly in the United States, but elsewhere as well. Okay? So this will create more and more inequality because wealth is more concentrated in very few people. Income is distributed amongst all of us. Okay? So this will eventually produce massive 19th century style inequality of opportunity. And there's some evidence from the voting behavior of the US Congress that, you know, unlike what Abraham Lincoln said, it is government of the rich, by the rich, for the rich. The term in political science is called plutocracy. Then we have some other parallel developments. You know, God lives in Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., because that's where the White House is, that's where the Federal Reserve is, that's where the International Monetary Fund is, and that's where the World Bank is. And there, can we go back to the previous slide? There, the work by the IMF shows that high inequality is disadvantageous for economic growth. In other words, excessive inequality will prevent economic progress in a cross-section of countries, which includes developing countries, developed countries, you know, transition economies, blah, 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 etc., etc. So inequality lowers growth. Excessive inequality lowers growth. The other usual sort of, you know, aspirin to address excessive inequality is a degree of social protection, a little bit of distribution, you know, and so on. That's the kind of aspirin, but that's the kind of band-aid used to fix or make inequality more acceptable. They find that, you know, social protection, we were told generally as economists that expenditure by the state to reduce inequality, to give things to the poor, to redistribute income, usually created disincentives for growth. In other words, there was a trade-off between equity and efficiency, as was then described. Not anymore. This traditional trade-off between equity and efficiency is less salient than before, and the reason for that is, of course, market failure, as described by another saint. There are two saints in economics. One is called Amartya Sen, the other is called Joseph Stiglitz. Stiglitz, market failure, you know, adverse selection, moral hazard, creates market failure. All the welfare theorems in economics don't work anymore. Okay? I won't bore you with the, you know, the week 12 of Microeconomics 201, but that's where we are. So what will this inequality do? It will not create this kind of civil war, you know, as will be addressed on June 26th in your conference in Antwerp, which you kindly organized, Raul, but it will lead to the newer forms of conflict. Last slide, please. The newer forms of conflict are mass protest, insurgencies in economically successful countries, you know, Maoist insurgencies in India, problems in China, and of course, greater sectarian violence and terrorism. Okay, thank you for your patience.
I have personally thanked Professor Murshid for disclosing that I asked him to speak about a dying concept, and he showed me what was really the point. But my question was exactly this, because do we perceive ourselves as a member of groups, or do we shape our behavior because of our individual culture, experience, or whatever? So this is an extremely good question for a social scientist, but it's also for policymakers, because some policymakers do make policies looking at, from the starting point of these workers, looking at groups. We started speaking about minorities. Of course, that means that by definition we're speaking about groups. Professor Mushu said that basically the conflict, I mean the risk we have of an increasing violence, of perhaps also a social routine violence, is emerging not because of groups, but because of individual attitudes, and these individuals descend from rising wealth inequality. So it's so in spite of my question, this was the goal. Okay. So next, in our commitment to in our commitment to enrich the library, you also can find some books of Professor Mirë that we bought, okay? So if you want to depend his work in the past. So next, I'm pleased to introduce again Andy Bala from Albanian Institute of International Studies. As I told you, it is the most important think tank in Tirana, to my knowledge at least, and I ask him to give a sketch about Albania. So I think it's because Albania is a plural society. We know this. You know, of course, better than me. So it's interesting the point of view, even in the light of the suggestion given by the professor. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's an honor to be here. I had to step in last minute for a colleague of mine who had a health emergency, but it's great to be here, first and foremost, to listen to these fascinating presentations that we're hearing today. I'm here to give a more of a local perspective, and a lot of the things that I'll be talking about, a lot of the Albanians in the room will already be familiar with, but I think it's important to point them out nonetheless. This talk here today is about preserving the gift of harmony here in Albania, and challenges that we might face in the future in preserving harmony in our internal diversity here in this country. Albania is a really good example. We believe, and this is the case globally, for coexistence and harmony. It's a value that Albania does have. In fact, it needs to promote more, to advertise it more in the world, to also help improve its image. Ethnic and religious communities in this country live side by side. They intermarry, they celebrate each other's holidays, visit each other's holy places. Now, I was listening to Professor Kaplan's talk, and Albania is indeed a very ethnically homogeneous country by Balkan standards. But we do have some ethnic minorities as well, Greeks, Armenians, Serbian, Bulgarians, etc., that have lived many years in this country, and individuals from these communities have made great strides in Albanian politics, business community, academia, arts. They're fully integrated into the Albanian society. But perhaps more importantly, in terms of numbers, Albania has been blessed both with its religious diversity and tolerance. Its Muslim and Christian communities live side by side, intermingle, together with non-religious and simply spiritual Albanians. But the key message that we need to remember in a place like this is that harmony and coexistence are not to be taken for granted. We know conflicts of an ethnic and of a religious nature are very quick to be provoked by manipulative politicians and people with ulterior motives. I would like to start by looking at the main assets that work in preserving the harmony that Albania enjoys. First and foremost is our heritage in this country. Religious harmony and tolerance is taught to children since they're at a very young age. It is very organic. It is built in a natural way, taught in our families and experiences. And one of the things that I'd like to point out is the very nature of Albanians as a people. If we look at the history of Albanians as a people, it has been a history in which the country has tried to persevere. It has tried to keep to its own traditions and culture throughout the centuries, surrounded by people that speak different languages and are of a different culture. And for a small nation, this is not a small feat. This is both good and bad. It is bad in the sense that it's sometimes harder for people in this country to sort of embrace the good things that come from the outside, the progress in politics, business, innovation, good governance, reforms that we're trying to implement to make this country better. However, it is also good. It is good because negative influences from the outside, what we see today in religious radicalism and conflict, are also harder to make inroads in this country, which it is a blessing. Radicalization is getting a lot of media attention all over the world and in Albania as well. But if you think about it, even at its peak, it has not managed to make any inroads, any meaningful inroads in Albanian society. And I'll get back to this topic a bit later. Another asset is the very social fabric of Albania, the society, the way it is built. Because of interfaith marriages, because of intermingling of society in general, and because of the country's history, there is really no segregation in Albanian society based on a particular group, religious or ethnic for that matter. Another great asset is that we have had very good and responsible religious institutions and leaders in these post-communist transition years. These preachers, these clerics, the religious leaders of this country from all faith communities have been very committed to preserving these values of tolerance and positivity that Albania has. And just at the beginning of our electoral campaign a few days ago, there was a joint statement which was very positive from all 5 recognized religious communities in the country, calling for a peaceful and tolerant campaign in the politic realm as well. But now that we have spoken about the assets, it's important to point to some risks as well. Things that we need to look to, that we might have to deal with in order to preserve this rich tradition of harmony in Albania, of which we take so much pride in. What are the main threats of managing diversity in Albania today? One key threat that could be, because this is a highly politicized society, it could be that there could be a political use of religion, a political use of religious communities. Luckily, this hasn't been the case in the past. Both politicians and religious communities have been very good at keeping this at bay. But sometimes when we're starting to see this at certain spots in their campaign, politicians do not resist the temptation to lure sort of religious groups with promises of giving them special treatment, or in particular in this country, we have the problem of restitution of properties which were taken from many Albanians, but also religious communities as well from communism. But for all the ills that Albanian politicians have, this hasn't been much of a problem so far, but this is something to keep an eye on. And more importantly, sometimes this is combined with ethnic factor as well, which makes it even more problematic. Another threat that we should keep an eye on is the political use of ethnicity. As I mentioned earlier, there are both ethnic and linguistical and cultural minorities here in Albania. We have had the political use of ethnicity in political campaigns before, especially when dealing with the Greek minority in the country. But fortunately, this has been so far has been in the conflict in the media, rhetoric, and in everyday life there has been largely a sort of equilibrium that has existed in many years, and it's not directly felt in society as discrimination or radicalization so far. As a journalist by trade, I think it's also important to mention that media could be a risk as well if it doesn't do its job properly, if it offers improper coverage on any of these topics that we're speaking here today. We often might have a case in which media makes a small event, small incidents much bigger than they are, sort of increasing, causing harm to harmony, both ethnic and religious. The best tool that media can serve as is to teach respect, ethical values, and report on issues that promote stability and well-being in society. And to be fair, Albanian media, when it comes to religious harmony and tolerance, has done this in the past. We've had some more problems with sort of ethnic harmony and cohabitation. Last but not least, in the headlines, is religious extremism and radicalism. This is one of the most serious risks to security as well. Religious radicalism globally has reached a sort of an apex in the past 2 or 3 years, and Albania has been affected. So far, much of it has been external. It has not upset the coexistence of the diverse religious communities that live here. But this is a key risk to keep an eye at the moment to our harmony and coexistence here. This is a complex phenomenon. It is global in nature. It's not local. But we also do accept that this is not a phenomenon from which Albania is immune. So social and state stakeholders need to be involved to make sure that it is contained. Wrapping up, as the last speaker, I'm going to keep this relatively short. It is a unique responsibility of every Albanian citizen and group and institution to preserve and to pass on this important tradition that we have of religious harmony. And it's a gift, and we can't take it for granted. And we need to face the risks head on to make sure that it is the same, it is carried on in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving this sketch about Albania, but at the same time highlighting the current risk of this society. So I think that we have enough time for a round of questions. If there is some question, where is the other microphone? It's working now? Okay, so is there anybody who wants to pose a question? Colleague, Professor Busciati.
Thank you. This was very interesting, actually. I'm a great admirer of Israeli work, and especially what you showed to us. To me, it was very interesting on primary data and findings. As an economist, I might have more than a couple of questions, but also as a politician, I'm a member of the Albanian parliament. I can have a political question. Your findings show that Palestinian side, in order to win more, let's say, leeway from the Israelis, they need to increase the level of violence. Did you have any conflict in giving out the results to the public? Because the Palestinians might read, or the Hamas, or whatever the special groups, if they find out that if they increase the level of violence, they can increase their leverage. So how was the result, or did you think about it twice before giving out the results, or did it have any repercussions, or what was the feedback from the politics side of the population? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very important and interesting question. So the results show that violence may work, but it also shows that violence may work to a certain extent. So first of all, violence is very costly to Israeli society, and for that reason, it forces Israeli to think about the occupation as more costly and to try to grant concessions. On the other hand, violence is also very costly to Palestinian society. Okay, so if we look at the Palestinian economy, it collapsed during the second Palestinian uprising. So it's not that I am suggesting the violence is the right way to obtain political concessions and to promote your own political goals. And the important methodological point that I want to make is that, first of all, the first point is that violence is costly to both sides. But the second methodological point is that I am looking at the effect of violence compared to nothing, to no violence. But I'm not looking to the effects of violence compared to a peaceful protest against, or a non-violent protest against the occupation. So it's not that I'm saying you need to use violence to promote your goals. You can also use some non-violent methods that may be more effective. Okay, so I wasn't, as a quantitative social scientist, I wasn't able to estimate the impact or the effectiveness of non-violent methods because there weren't none. But it may be more effective for Palestinian society to promote their political goals using non-violent methods, especially since violent methods are costly for them too, very, very costly. Like BDS, for example. I'm not recommending that, but it may be more effective to use that type of political methods. It may be like promoting international pressure, etc., etc.
Other questions? Yes, please.
Just to follow up what you're saying, BDS, I'm curious how is seen locally the EU action. Okay, I'm Artes Budka from the EU delegation to Albania. I just wanted to know how is perceived locally the EU, let's say, policy, neighborhood policy, and especially, for example, just noting, mentioning the BDS. As you know, EU, some member states have practically requested to notice in their, let's say, merchandise labeling, the settlement, that, these products are produced in the settlements and not in Israel. And how these actions are seen locally, in the ground there, how EU, let's say, policy or member states, for example, the recognition of Palestine by some member states is seen in the ground.
Thank you again for a very interesting question. So I'm going to repeat this. I'm not a politician. I'm a social scientist, and my work is looking at data and looking at the effect of these different processes. We don't have systematic studies of that question, but my casual interpretation of it is that the Israeli political map is divided, I would say right now, 60% to the right wing and 40% to the left wing parties, and the view of these external actions are very highly correlated with your political views. So usually supporters of right wing parties are very much against any type of external pressure on Israel because they're also the governing party, and they think that the governing party should set policy without any external pressure, whereas the left-wing side of the political map, because they're also not governing right now, they do promote, for the most part, external pressure as a way to curb the power of the right-wing coalition.
Other question? Please introduce yourself.
Florian Saleh Al-Balarati, president. It's an association of Albanian ex-students graduated in Italy. I apologize for my English because it's not as well as good as the other speakers, but I have a question. Does there is any studies in terms of opportunity costs, not only in terms of monetary costs, but in terms of living costs related to Palestinians? Because it's a question. It is possible to anyone that has nothing to lose to see the things optimistically, or to understand that maybe something different is possible? Because I don't see the question if maybe you had the possibility to live with certain extent of amounts of incomes or changing your way of living, how your behavior would be in the studies. It's an eye-to-eye politics, and I don't percept, and, or it's my perception, to make things a little different. It's an utopistic question, but I'm curious. Thank you.
Could I? No, here we go. So, this is not based on my research. I have a colleague, Scott Atrin and Associates, anthropologist by training. And he and his colleagues are doing some very interesting work on what they call sacred values, especially in the context of various conflicts in the Middle East. And one thing that they have found is that values that are held very, very dearly, this includes statehood for many Palestinians. It matters more than anything. In other words, and they've also looked at and have actually interviewed Islamic State captives incredibly before they were executed. They've had privileged access by Kurds to interview them. And they've done some fascinating studies, some of which have been published in Science magazine, so one of the leading journals of science worldwide. And they find that values that are held so dearly that they will be more important than anything else. And indeed, in the context of the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, they have even found that individuals are offended and insulted at the suggestion that you compromise on certain fundamental points in exchange for which you'll get maybe a financial benefit. So, I mean, I can't speak myself to the validity of their findings. They seem very robust, and it's very, very interesting because it also suggests that what may be a more constructive and less constructive way of approaching the conflict, but that you, in effect, cannot buy off supporters of certain things that are certain objectives, certain goals that are thought to be absolutely fundamental.
Thank you. I agree with Richard's answer.
Other questions? I would invite students. Do you have any questions for her? I mean, if not, what comments?
Feel free also.
As professors, if students in particular have questions, it would be pleasing. Come on, be brave. Every question is allowed.
You can also feel free to ask in Italian, and Raul is going to translate for us. So.
Even in Albania, yes. Someone?
If not, may I be considered as a student?
No, yeah.
Can I make?
Only because you are a dean. If you step down, you could be a student.
If you want to give me my...
There you go. Okay, Professor Lajoy.
So, first of all, I would like to thank you, all the speakers, for their nice presentations and for stimulating us different ideas and comments. I have two curiosity in order to, and I would like to have your comments about this. First of all, you spoke about the possibility to, or the necessity to consider minor part of society. So, how we can make a possible relationship between this necessity. So we have to consider the minority rights of all society, all part of society, and the necessity to avoid a lot of parties in the democratic process. So if in our parliament, for instance, we have a lot of parties, it is obvious more difficult to discuss and to carry out the democratic process. So how we can make the right relationship between this aspect? For instance, I have a detailed question. Is it okay the ratio equal to 5% considering the voting you have taken during the election process in order to be present in the parliament? And this could be one comment and one question. The second one concerns inequality. So obviously the differences between social parties in our society is boosting and enhancing all the conflicts. So I would like to have some proposals concerning the possibility to overcome this inequality, which is deeply spread in our economies. So please, I'm curious about your comments.
Thank you very much. With respect to the first question, I have to say, so my field within political science is international relations, and your question is really about comparative politics, comparative government. I can't claim expertise. I can tell you that something to bear in mind that's important, whether or not a country can exist in harmony with many different groups is a broader question than whether and how they should be perhaps represented or participate in government, in parliament, for instance. The quote that I gave you from John Stuart Mill suggests the difficulty or even impossibility of a well-functioning state or government, and I disagree. I think there's not evidence to support that that is necessarily the case, and that isn't certainly the view reflected in the policies that I was discussing earlier. There is a separate but related question about how much representation groups should have, and this whole question of the threshold and the functionality is a very different question. I mean, there are a lot of countries that have high representation and it would appear weak governments. I mean, Israel is one where I don't know what the threshold is, but here it's not even so much a question of different national or ethnic communities, but so many different parties of, I mean, some of them with just one seat, and their vital need for forming coalitions, and they have disproportionate influence to the support they have in society, because they're absolutely vital to allowing a coalition to form. Italy is another country which historically, and there have been efforts to change this over the years, have had a large number of small parties, and that has sometimes created the difficulty also of forming, if you will, strong, lasting governments. I come from a country which has the opposite system, or the United States, even worse, if I can put it that way, in the United States, where there's no hope for any third party. It's because of the structure of politics in that country, the structure of government in that country makes it almost impossible for a third party candidate to succeed. So you almost always have a choice only between two candidates. So that creates a certain stability, but it reduces also the range of options available to you. And in the United Kingdom, where I come from, there's a a push by the smaller parties, the Liberal Democrats in particular, for proportional representation, which we do not have. So I'm not qualified really to speak to, I'm just giving you impressions based on my understanding, my survey of the situation, but maybe, well, you're all economists, aren't you? I don't know. We're the political scientists. Yeah, maybe you want to speak to this question specifically from a comparative standpoint, I don't know.
The oxygen of the mic, yeah. Thank you. Yes, in studies of inequality and conflict, particularly, the group-based inequality and conflict, which is called horizontal inequality. The political horizontal inequality is found to be more important, simply because of two reasons. Politics and economics are inseparable, so political inequality will produce economic inequality and vice versa. And there is more data, or you can create data of political inequality. You can say, well, this community is not allowed to participate in elections, or the constitution of a country does not permit someone from this particular religion or group to become the president of the republic, or things like that. So there's all this, data in there. So it's very hard to know what is important there. But I believe the findings are that if a group has been recently excluded from power or participating in the political process, if a group has been recently excluded, meaning the last 5 years or so, then the risk of conflict, of civil war is increased, the risk is substantially, statistically, significantly enhanced. Okay, so this is what I can mention to you from the literature on conflict and so-called horizontal inequality. Now, my colleagues who work on this, if I can call them colleagues, is that they say that what is important is they would like to change the phrase from horizontal inequality, this is group inequality between groups, to another term called categorical inequality, which they borrow from an American, God forbid, sociologist called Charles Tilly. Categorical inequalities are inequalities of opportunity based upon, an identity marker. So, people from this group, so, all I have to do is put my name down as Muhammad Ali and I'll never be asked for a job, invited to a job interview. Things like that. That's what they mean by categorical inequalities, for example. Okay. So they are moving in that direction. What I am saying is that, these categorical inequalities and horizontal inequalities, could be important, could remain important in explaining why there is violent conflict, but, essentially the growth of inequality in general is producing these newer forms of inequality of opportunity. So it's creating new minorities, as it were. The growth of inequality in general will create minorities, the excluded groups. And what have we done to address exclusion? We can look at the period when there's been falling inequality all over the world. The period after the Second World War to, let's say, 1980 or the mid-70s. And that is basically through, the growth of, through the provision of public education. In your country of birth, through something called the General Inductee Bill, which allowed those who served in the armed forces to receive a publicly funded college education. Not having your college-style tuition fees, in the United Kingdom, which is, I believe, what is it, £100,000 a year in your college? 9,000. Yeah. So, education reduces inequality. And the other thing is that we have policies which basically lead to wealth, the rate of return on wealth, as opposed to other rates of return on investment in productive capital, manufacturing, for example, is only 2%. You have interest rates which are so low, but a rate of return on certain forms of financial wealth increasing at 16 to 20%. So this is producing more and more inequality, I think.
Okay, I think we can stop here. And before, of course, I'm asking the rector to give the final word, but before that, just a couple of things. First of all, I remarked a couple of times that as CESPIC we are building, we are structuring this peace science library. So if you are interested in this topic, you can find books on this. On this stuff. I mean, it's the first time. I mean, that this kind of books are. I take the occasion to thank Mimosa, who's there, who's leading the library, who's supporting me in building up this library, this peace science library. So eventually, as usual, I do thank all the people who contributed to this event, Daniela from the press office, Nils and Diana from the marketing office, and Barda from the economics, School of Economics coordination. Thank you to all of you for staying here, for participating into this event. Usually the success of events depends on how many people are in a room. But I would add that it's not only the number, it's also the eyes focus on speakers make the difference. I noticed many that you pay a lot of attention to argument, to the topics debated today. So, Professor Giardina, please, the last word.
Thank you, Raul. Well, it was really a fascinating and stimulating morning. Thank you very much to all the speakers. It was really very, very fascinating and exciting in some way, because in my opinion, the first step, I'm not a biochemist, so it's quite far from your fields, but it was really nice to be here, and it is important as a first step to know within which kind of frame there is the problem. The various problems we are confronted to are within a given frame. So you have to know the details of this frame. I think that in the future we will be confronted with several other problems. These, of course, are the main and the historical problems. But since I worked for many years in the Faculty of Medicine, we will be confronted with other types of minorities, because there will be the aging of population, the increased aging of population will create a minority or a majority. The health people will be the minority or the majority. And children, what about children, babies? So I think that at least for for Europe, United States. I mean, a big problem in the future will be the increased age of the population, which will reduce the money for other initiatives. And in a given period of time, it could really enhance some type of conflicts. But this is, I mean, this is something out of the task of this morning. Is just a final comment. And once again, thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you to Professor La Gioia, Professor Busciati, everybody in the room. And I hope to have more and more of this type of morning, and maybe also with some of our speakers now. Thank you very much.